Welcome to Ethics in the Computer Age, Lecture 1, Part 2. In this lecture, we're going to pick up in part where we left off in an earlier lecture, in Part 1. We're going to start with a more in-depth look at Charles Darwin, and from there we're going to move into a discussion of the readings of this week, and to further talk about how the West became dysfunctional and why solving ethical and moral problems pertaining to technology is so difficult, if not bordering on the impossible. So with that in mind, I want to begin by drawing a distinction which we will use multiple times in this class. And that distinction is between ethics and morality. The word morality comes from the Latin mors, which means custom or tradition. By definition, morality is specific to a given culture or to a given society. Ethics, on the other hand, is normative for all humans for all time. We will, throughout the course, be drawing a continued distinction between these two. If you think about the concept of ethics, it requires a kind of universal answer to the human question. That is to say, one that is inclusive of all human societies, whether they're life affirmative, life negative, or life neutral. The closest that we've come to that is the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. The downfall of the Declaration of Human Rights is the fact that it can be affirmed by a country, but not implemented by a country. So even the United States, in terms of its adherence to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has come up short. And because this is simply voluntary, it leaves the entire situation of decision-making when it comes to ethical issues to each society in and of itself. As a result, privacy in the United States, as you'll see, is not privacy in China. The reality of the matter is that until and unless there is a universal definition of human rights, that all of the problems we face in the end are morality, they are moral, they are within the domain of a given society. And therefore, how our society chooses to resolve the questions and the issues may in fact have nothing to do with how another society or culture might. We want to make sure that we avoid judging other societies based upon our definition of what it means to be human. Okay, I promised we would go back to Charles Darwin, and we're going to do that again. If you recall, we said that in the Darwinian model, as complexity increases, consciousness grows, instinct diminishes. We want to add that, particularly in a life negative culture, as consciousness increases, so does the need for more advanced needs of technology. Excuse me. One of the main problems we face, which Darwin did not anticipate, is that in the end, technology, when coupled with science, serves to demythologize what it means to be human. So, I'll give you an example. In the world prior to Darwin, let's go back to the first century of the Common Era, there was absolutely no doubt, at least in Christian culture, absolutely no doubt that to be human is to have a soul, that the soul was immortal and are linked to God. As such, what defines the soul is logic and reason. And logic and reason are synonymous with consciousness. As you'll see when we talk about René Descartes, this gave rise to the mind-body problem, where in some shape or form, consciousness, which is now equated with the soul, is identical with the human mind. And the question embodied in the mind-body problem is, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? Ultimately, by the 15th century, this will become part of a concept called special creation. Which is, even though humans have a body, and that body is the link to the physical created world, there is something fundamentally different, something which distinguishes all humans from all other life forms. And that is, of course, the mind. There are two problems here. The first problem is that in the 21st century, if we are to be true to the science of our day, then all mental states are brain states. The mind is the brain. So the very idea that philosophers continue to debate the mind-body problem further suggests the point that I made in part one of this lecture, which was that in the end, we live intellectually in one world, experientially in a completely different, incompatible world. And in light of the Darwinian analysis, there is no room for the concept of soul. None. There is no room for the concept of mind being linked to soul. The brain is the mind. We are our bodies. Therefore, when we talk about artificial intelligence, one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is, what really constitutes processing information? How do we engage the world? Do we engage the world first logically? Or are we actually emotional creatures who happen to be logical as well? And part of that is inherent in the Darwinian analysis, and it's also reflective of the modern roots of racism. Because if we look at the Darwinian model closely, then prior to birth, all humans repeat the whole history of evolution. The natural end of human evolution for Darwin is not Caucasians. It's Northern European whites. All other humans are stopping points, bookmarks on the path to full human evolution. That includes Southern European whites. So in the Darwinian model, there is a difference between being human and being fully human. Human evolution itself represents a process over and above organic evolution that drives the whole of the cosmos for Charles Darwin. And evolution, in Darwinian terms, becoming fully human means becoming fully rational and logical. That's it. So any exercise of emotion, any attempt to define humans in terms that don't involve Northern European culture, science, mathematics, will be deemed ineffective or prone to inaccuracy. We're going to come back to this multiple times throughout the semester, particularly when we look at the relationship between logic and reason on one hand and emotion and intuition in others on the other, when we talk about neural networks versus traditional artificial intelligence. All right, let's focus in now on the subject at hand in the readings this week. Giordano Bruno, Michael Servetos, Galileo, Descartes, and how that frames the conversation we're going to be having today and in future classes about ethics or morality in the computer age. We can talk about an inherent tension in Western culture between Aristotle and Plato. Even though Plato was Aristotle's teacher, the two men did not see the world the same way. Every time Plato ran into a limit of language or found it difficult in logical discourse to explain something, he resorted to myth. And he resorted to mythological references to a kind of poetic, intuitive view of the world. We see this repeatedly throughout the Platonic corpus. So I would argue there is no theory of forms in Plato. It was simply a mechanism, a metaphor used to try to understand how is it that we know that even though a chair has three legs, it's still a chair, somehow distinct, but somehow universally recognizable. The problem with Plato is really Aristotle's reading of Plato. Aristotle's rise to intellectual prominence by the first century of the Common Era means that Plato will be read through the eyes of Aristotle. As a consequence of that, Western culture will focus not on emotion and intuition, but on logic and reason. Throughout the course of Western history and at critical turning points, for example, in the first century, when Paul, who was a Roman citizen, though a Jew, takes his message of Christianity and he adds to it Greek thought. When Augustine converted to Christianity, there was a kind of reintroduction of Aristotle. Unabashedly, Thomas Aquinas reappropriated Aristotle yet again to create a Christian systematic theology that is clearly Aristotelian. The point I want to make here is that we've never left Aristotle behind, and the Aristotelian paradigm has been modified multiple times, though in effect crashing down, coming to an end in the 16th century into the 17th. In effect, we have never let go. Our intellectual framework, our spiritual framework, our emotional framework is shaped by the way in which Aristotle saw the world. Until and unless we reunite how we think about the world and how we experience the world, the West will continue to be dysfunctional. So let's focus on some of the events that led to that split. In 1553, Michael Servetus was arrested in Geneva and burned at the stake for challenging John Calvin. One of the ironies of the Protestant Reformation is that the Protestant reformers challenged the traditional institutionalized theocracy. Since the year 322, when Constantine converted to Christianity, Christianity had become inseparable from the power structure, intellectual framework, and culture of the Roman Empire. The Protestant reformers denied the idea that the king's authority ultimately came through the Pope from God. And yet, ironically, as soon as John Calvin got a toehold in Geneva, Switzerland, what did he do? The answer is he instituted a theocracy. Symbolically, Servetus's dying, Servetus's being burned at the stake, should have brought to an end theocracy. Instead, it's the beginning of the fissure in Western culture that has led to the dysfunctioning of the West. In 1593, Giordano Bruno is arrested. He will be tortured for 7 years. And in 1600, he will be stripped, hung upside down, burned at the stake in the Square of Flowers in Rome, and his ashes scattered into the Tiber River. It's an error to think that he was killed because he endorsed the heliocentric theory of the universe. Heliocentric, a sun-centered universe, as opposed to a Terra-centric universe, an Earth-centered universe. Bruno was not the first to argue that the sun was the center of the universe. Copernicus, Kepler, Brahe, even Galileo, and others had argued for a heliocentric theory of the universe. And initially, the bishops didn't have a problem with what Bruno said. Bruno got in trouble for a very different reason. The second pillar of the Aristotelian world, and the third, are theosophy and theonomy. Theosophy. All moral problems can be settled or resolved in theological terms. Theonomy, theology is the queen of the sciences. That means that if the world is created in 7 days according to Genesis, despite any empirical evidence to the contrary, science is bound by the biblical truth. Science takes precedence, or takes its precedence from theology. The Bible, systematic theology, cannot in any shape or form be contradicted. Bruno argued that this was actually wrong, that in the end, it would be science that determined the truth of theology. If Bruno were true, if Bruno were right, then the entire fabric of Western culture would have collapsed. The only option was for Bruno to die. And Bruno would not be alone. Vanini and numerous others would follow him to death. Let's fast forward now after the death of Bruno. We can talk about Galileo all day. We can talk about whether or not he really discovered what he claims to have discovered. We can talk about the size of the man's ego, for sure. But one thing is true. By the death of Bruno into the year 1620, Galileo is now an aging man who has a number of medical problems. He will repeatedly avoid inquisition until ultimately, despite claiming ill health and the inability to travel, he is in fact brought to trial. Legend has it that Galileo invited the bishops to his rooftop to look through his telescope in the hopes that when they looked through the telescope, they would see exactly what caused him to argue that the sun was the center of the universe. As legend has it, when they looked through the telescope, they didn't see anything. Whatever really happened, and I'm inclined to believe it was simply the pragmatism of an old man. Galileo was given the choice: recant, that is, take back what you've said, or die. He got down on his knees in the cathedral, asked for forgiveness, confessed his sin, and recanted. At the same time, a then very young man by the name of René Descartes, mathematician, philosopher, polymath, was working on his equivalent of the theory of everything. When word got to Descartes that Galileo had recanted, when Descartes began to think that he would summon the same faith or suffer the same fate, he burned everything. Burned it all. While elements of his theory of everything would be published later in his life, they were published without, in any shape or form, challenging established church dogma. Let's look at more closely at how Descartes responded, because it set up the beginning of what I call the age of denial and is responsible for the fissure which keeps us from living in one world, which keeps us living in one world and thinking about the world in a very different way. The book, excerpts of which we'll be reading, is called The Meditations. And it begins with a very simple question of what can I be certain? And Descartes says that there are two options. The first is that I can be sure of nothing. The second is that there is something about which I can be certain. He dismisses this as simply absurd. He doesn't really consider it. And if you think about it, if he were to consider it seriously, then potentially he could question the intellectual framework that had demanded the death of Bruno. So instead, he concludes there must be something about which we can be certain. And the answer is I think, therefore I am. So the question then becomes, well, what do I think about? And Descartes said, well, obviously, I think about ideas. And when I think about ideas, I realize that there are two types of ideas, finite and limited, and infinite. His logic is really very simple. I'm a human being, and therefore I'm finite and limited. Because of original sin, I'm guilty and limited in how I perceive the world. But yes, ideas which are finite and limited, they can have their origin in humans. But I also have ideas which are different. For example, the perfect island. Well, if I'm imperfect, how can I possibly conceive of anything perfect? This begins the path to the concept or the argument for the unmoved mover. But before we look at this, his point here is that if we can conceive of any concept of perfection, a perfect being must exist. If we can conceive of any notion of perfection, a perfect being must exist. And that perfect being is God. God is placed back in the center of the universe. All right, let's take a closer look at the unmoved mover. Descartes begins with a very simple assertion. Everything has a cause. To assume everything has a cause indefinitely, infinitely, is absurd. Therefore, there must be an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover. God. In the process, Descartes falls prey to a concept, a logical fallacy rather, which we're going to talk about because we're going to see this repeatedly over the course of the semester in many of the works we're going to read. It is called Posthoc, ergo, propter hoc. From this, it necessarily follows that. That ultimately is the process of reasoning from effect to cause, which you cannot do. Example, you're supposed to meet a friend at 6 o'clock. You're supposed to go to dinner. Your friend never shows up. You assume that you did something to offend your friend. You find out 20 minutes later that he or she or they had a flat tire along the way and couldn't make the date, and the cell phone battery was dead. We cannot reason from effect to cause, even though we do it all the time. That's exactly what Descartes did to put God back in the center of the universe. All right, a couple more points before we bring this part 2 of the lecture to sleep. Let's talk about what was happening at the same time that Descartes was penning the Meditations. It's amazing to think that Descartes was reading the work of Edward Herbert when Descartes was moving throughout Europe and Edward Herbert was in England. How they were able to exchange correspondences in a world without a post office is truly amazing. But they did. Herbert wrote a book called De Veritate, in English, Concerning the Truth of Revelation. Herbert argued that revelation through Scripture through systematic theology was not valid. That instead, if we truly wanted to know God, to know the world, is to know God. Though I'm sure Edward Herbert had no idea of what the implications of this were, it prompts a shift from an a priori view of the world, as in a priori means beforehand. That is to say, the view of the world found in Genesis or found in systematic theology, to a view of the world and human experience a posteriori, after the fact. What we know from experience. In effect, this is where the West split. Because intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, we remain in this world. How you can possibly believe in angels in the 21st century? Well, the only way you can possibly do that is because spiritually you're mired in the world that died 500 years ago. knowledge for the sake of knowledge, the unbridled advance of technology and science without regard for the impact. That's directly from Edward Herbert. So, empirically, experientially, scientifically, technologically, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. This is why we are where we are. A couple more comments and we'll be done. I want to call your attention to two men, Plotinus and Ptolemy. Using the Aristotelian model, Plotinus put together a very hierarchical model of how life forms and creation work. Obviously, the higher you go, the closer you are to God. In his view of the world, by the way, male and female, male higher than female. And then, of course, the races with Caucasians at the top, Bonaventure would come along and he would argue, oh, humans can't get to God directly. So he invented the concept of angels, 9 orders of them, 3 major and 3 minor, as the intermediaries between humans and gods. On the scientific side, the pterocentric view of the world by Ptolemy argued that the earth was flat and covered by a dome. It floated on the waters of chaos, which, when they splashed too high, came through the windows in the form of rain. The sun, the stars, the planets were all hung from the dome. God was in the center of all humans, humans in the center of the earth in the center of the cosmos. So as we come to the end of this lecture, I would urge you to think about the consequences of what we've been talking about today. And when you think about the fact that all the technology we use is a reflection of how we answer the human question. All the technology we use is a function of how we answer the human question. Then I would ask you to look at the technology currently in use and ask yourself, how does it answer the human question? Until next time.